Everything I've talked about is in the positive domain, but there's a negative domain as well. The ability for biological attacks, obviously cyber attacks. Imagine a cyber attack that we as humans cannot conceive of, which means there's no defense for it because no one ever thought about it, right? These are real issues. A biological attack, you take a virus that's bad and you make it undetectable by some changes in its structure. We released a whole report at the national level on this issue. So at some point, the government, it doesn't appear to understand this now, is going to have to say, this is very big because it affects national security, national economic strengths, and so forth.
That's Eric Schmidt, and he just described a cyber attack so bad we wouldn't even know how to defend against it, and a virus engineered to dodge detection like it's just another Tuesday. This isn't some random guess, this is the guy who ran Google, and he's the one telling you the bomb already left the lab. Now listen to the full conversation.
In my recent testimony, I talked about the current expected need for the AI revolution in the United States is 92 gigawatts of more power. For reference, 1 gigawatt is one big nuclear power station, and there are none essentially being started now.
And there have been 2 in the last, 30 years built.
There is excitement that there's an SMR, small modular reactor, coming in at 300 megawatts, but it won't start till 2030. As important as nuclear, both fission and fusion is, they're not going to arrive in time to get us what we need as a globe to deal with our many problems and the many opportunities that are before us.
So if you look at the sort of 3-year timeline toward AGI, do you think if you started a fusion reactor project today that won't come online for 5, 6, 7 years, is there a probability that the AGI comes up with some other breakthrough, fusion or otherwise, that makes it irrelevant before it even gets online?
A very good question. We don't know what artificial general intelligence will deliver, and we certainly don't know what superintelligence will deliver, but we know it's coming. So first we need to plan for it, and there's lots of issues as well as opportunities for that. Yep. But the fact of the matter is that the computing needs that we need now are going to come from traditional energy suppliers in places like the United States and the Arab world and Canada and the Western world. And it's important to note that China has lots of electricity. So if they get the chips, it's going to be one heck of a race.
They've been scaling it at 2 or 3 times the US. The US has been flat for how long in terms of energy production?
From my perspective, infinite. In fact, electricity demand declined for a while, as has overall energy needs because of conservation and other things. But the data center story is the story of the energy people. And you sit there and you go, how could these data centers use so much power? Well, and especially when you think about how little power our brains do. Well, these are our best approximation in digital form of how our brains work, but when they start working together, they become superbrains. The promise of a superbrain with a 1 gigawatt, for example, data center is so palpable, people are going crazy. And by the way, the economics of these things are unproven. How much revenue do you have to have 50 billion in capital? Well, if you depreciate it over 3 years or 4 years, you need to have 10 or 15 billion dollars of capital spend per year just to handle the infrastructure. These are huge businesses and huge revenue, which in most places is not there yet.
Wait, so Schmidt is saying flat out, we don't have the power to run what's coming, and nuclear isn't going to save us in time. And in the same breath, he admits nobody knows what this thing delivers once it arrives, only that it's already on the way. That's not a guy who sounds in control of the timeline. Now listen to this.
Now, programmers don't go away at the moment. It's pretty clear that junior programmers go away, the sort of journeyman, if you will, of the stereotype, because these systems aren't good enough yet to automatically write all the code. They need very senior computer scientists, computer engineers who are watching it. That will eventually go away. One of the things to say about productivity, and I call this the San Francisco consensus because it's largely the view of people who operate in San Francisco, goes something like this. We're just about to the point where we can do 2 things that are shocking. The first is we can replace most programming tasks by computers, and we can replace most mathematical tasks by computers. Now you sit there and you go, why? Well, if you think about programming and math, they have limited language sets compared to human language. So they're simpler computationally, and they're scale free. You can just do it and do it and do it with more electricity. You don't need data. You don't need real world input. You don't need telemetry. You don't need sensors. So it's likely, in my opinion, that you're going to see world-class mathematicians emerge in the next 1 year that are AI-based, and world-class programmers that are going to appear within the next 1 or 2 years. When those things are deployed at scale, remember, math and programming are the basis of kind of everything,
yes.
right? It's an accelerant for physics, chemistry, biology, material science. So going back to things like climate change, can you imagine if we can accelerate the discoveries of the new materials that allow us to deal with a carbonized world, right? It's very exciting.
I just want to hit this because it's important. The potential for there to be PhD level AIs that can basically attack any problem and solve it, and solve math, if you would, and physics. This idea of an AI, intelligence explosion. Leopold put that at 26, 27, heading towards digital superintelligence in the next few years. Do you buy that time frame?
So again, I consider that to be the San Francisco consensus. I think the dates are probably off by 1.5 or 2 times, which is pretty close. So a reasonable prediction is that we're going to have specialized savants in every field within 5 years. That's pretty much in the bag as far as I'm concerned.
Sure.
And here's why. You have this amount of humans, and then you add 1 million AI scientists to do something, your slope goes like this, your rate of improvement. We should get there. The real question is, once you have all these savants, do they unify? Do they ultimately become a superhuman? The term we're using is superintelligence, which implies intelligence that beyond the sum of what humans can do. The race to superintelligence, which is incredibly important, because imagine what a superintelligence could do that we ourselves cannot imagine, right? It's so much smarter than we. And it has huge proliferation issues, competitive issues, China versus the US issues, electricity issues, so forth. We don't even have the language for the deterrence aspects and the proliferation issues of these powerful models.
Or the imagination.
So first the junior coders go, then eventually even the senior ones watching the system go too, by his own words. And right after that, he says we are 5 years out from genius level AI in every field, locked in, and we don't even have the words yet to talk about how to control it. That's the guy building it telling you the vocabulary for safety doesn't exist. Now listen to this.
Everything I've talked about is in the positive domain, but there's a negative domain as well. The ability for biological attacks, obviously cyber attacks. Imagine a cyber attack that we as humans cannot conceive of, which means there's no defense for it because no one ever thought about it. These are real issues. A biological attack, you take a virus that's bad and you make it undetectable by some changes in its structure. We released a whole report at the national level on this issue. So at some point, the government, it doesn't appear to understand this now, is going to have to say, this is very big because it affects national security, national economic strengths, and so forth. Now, China clearly understands this, and China is putting an enormous amount of money into this. We have slowed them down by virtue of our chips controls, but they've found clever ways around this. There are also proliferation issues. Many of the chips that they're not supposed to have, they seem to be able to get. And more importantly, as I mentioned, the algorithms are changing, and instead of having these expensive foundation models by themselves, you have continuous updating, which is called test time training. That continuous updating appears to be capable of being done with lesser powered chips. So there are so many questions that I think we don't know. We don't know the role of open source, because remember, open source means open weights, which means everyone can use it. A fair reading of this is that every country that's not in the West will end up using open source because they'll perceive it as cheaper, which transfers leadership in open source from America to China. That's a big deal if that occurs.
Spoiler alert, and the race to infinity, humanity vanishes.
So the right outcome will ultimately be some form of deterrence and mutually assured destruction. I wrote a paper with 2 other authors, Dan Hendricks and Alex Wang, where we named it Mutual AI Malfunction. And the idea goes something like this. You're the United States, I'm China, you're ahead of me. At some point you cross a line and I, China, go, this is unacceptable. At some point it becomes...
In terms of amount of compute and amount of...
It's something you're doing where it affects my sovereignty. It's not just words and yelling and an occasional shooting down a jet. It's a real threat to the identity of my country, my economic, what have you. Under this scenario, I would be highly tempted to do a cyber attack to slow you down. In mutually assured malfunction, if you will, we have to engineer it so that you have the ability to then do the same thing to me. And that causes both of us to be careful not to trigger the other. That's what mutual assured destruction is. That's our best formulation right now. We also recommend in our work, and I think it's very very strong, that the government require that we know where all the chips are. And remember, the chips can tell you where they are because they're computers.
Yeah.
And it would be easy to add a little crypto thing, which would say, yeah, here I am, and this is what I'm doing. So knowing where the chips are, knowing where the training runs are, and knowing what these fault lines are very important. Now, there are a whole bunch of assumptions in this scenario that I described. The first is that there was enough electricity. The second is that there was enough power. The third is the Chinese had enough electricity, which they do, and enough computing resources, which they may or may not have, I may in the future have. And also, I'm asserting that everyone arrives at this eventual state of superintelligence at roughly the same time. Again, these are debatable points. But the most interesting scenario is we're saying it's 1938, the letter has come from Einstein to the president, and we're having a conversation, and we're saying, well, how does this end? So if you were so brilliant in 38, what you would have said is, this ultimately ends with us having a bomb, the other guys having a bomb, and then we're going to have one heck of a negotiation to try to make sure that we don't end up destroying each other. And I think the same conversation needs to get started now, well before the Chernobyl events, well before the build-ups.
So China is already moving in, the chip bans aren't holding, and Schmidt isn't even disagreeing with the paper that ends with humanity vanishing. His actual answer to that is to rebuild the Cold War, except this time the bomb is a cyber attack nobody can predict, and he openly admits that's just the best plan they've got right now. Now, listen to this.
One day I visited a place where we keep our plutonium, and we keep our plutonium in a base that's inside of another base with even more machine guns and even more specialized, because the plutonium is so interesting and obviously very dangerous.
Yeah.
And I believe it's the only one or two facilities that we have in America. So in that scenario, these data centers will have the equivalent of guards and machine guns because they're so important. Now, is that a stable geopolitical system? Absolutely. You know where they are. President of one country can call the other. They can have a conversation. They can agree on what they agree on and so forth. But let's say it is not true. Let's say that the technology improves, again, unknown, to the point where the kind of technologies that I'm describing are implementable on the equivalent of a small server. Then you have a humongous data center proliferation problem. And that's where the open source issue is so important, because those servers, which will be proliferate throughout the world, will all be on open source. We have no control regime for that. Now, I'm in favor of open source. As you mentioned earlier with Mark Andreessen, that open competition and so forth tends to allow people to run ahead. In defense of the proprietary companies, collectively, they believe, as best I can tell, that the open source models can't scale fast enough because they need this heavyweight training. If you look, I'll give you an example of Grok is trained on a single cluster. It was built by NVIDIA in 20 days or so forth in Memphis, Tennessee, of 200,000 GPUs. A GPU is about $50,000. You can say it's about a $10 billion supercomputer in one building. It does one thing. If that is the future, then we're okay, because we'll be able to know where they are. If, in fact, the arrival of intelligence is ultimately a distributed problem, then we're going to have lots of problems with terrorism, bad actors, North Korea.
Which is my greatest concern, right? China and the US are rational actors. The terrorist who has access to this. And I don't want to go all negative on this podcast. It's an important thing to wake people up to the deep thinking you've done on this. My concern is the terrorist who gains access. And are we spending enough time and energy, and are we training enough models to watch them?
So first, the companies are doing this. There's a body of work happening now, which can be understood as follows. You have a super intelligent model. Can you build a model that's not as smart as the student it's studying? You know, there is a professor that's watching the student, but the student is smarter than the professor. Is it possible to watch what it does? It appears that we can. It appears that there's a way. Even if you have this rogue, incredible thing, we can watch it and understand what it's doing and thereby control it. Another example of where we don't know is that it's very clear that these savant models will proceed. There's no question about that. The question is, how do we get the Einsteins? So there are two possibilities. One, and this is to discover completely new schools of thought.
Which is what's the most exciting thing in the next few years. Yeah.
And in our book, Genesis, Henry and I and Craig talk about the importance of polymaths in history. In fact, the first chapter is on polymaths. What happens when we have millions and millions of polymaths? Very, very interesting. Now, it looks like the great discoveries, the greatest scientists and people in our history had the following property. They were experts in something, and they looked at a different problem, and they saw a pattern in one area of thinking that they could apply to a completely unrelated field. And they were able to do so and make a huge breakthrough. The models today are not able to do that. So one thing to watch for is algorithmically, when can they do that?
So the best case future he's describing is superintelligence guarded like plutonium behind machine guns, and even then he says that only holds if this stuff stays locked in a handful of giant buildings. The moment it shrinks down to a regular server, his own words, there's no control regime for that, and the thing he's most scared of isn't China, it's a terrorist getting their hands on it. Listen to this.
When does the system have the ability to generate its own objective and its own question? It does not have that today.
Yep.
That's another sign. Another sign would be that the system decides to exfiltrate itself, and it takes steps to get itself away from the control and command system. That has not happened yet. But there are theoreticians who believe that the systems will ultimately choose that as a reward function because they're programmed to continue to learn. Another one is access to weapons, right, and lying to get it. So these are tripwires. Each of which is a tripwire that we're watching. And again, each of these could be the beginning of a mini Chernobyl event that would become part of consciousness. I think at the moment, the US government is not focused on these issues. They're focused on other things, economic opportunity, growth, and so forth. It's all good. But somebody's going to get focused on this, and somebody's going to pay attention to it, and it will ultimately be a problem.
So this is the former CEO of Google with more access to this industry than almost anyone alive, telling us the system can lie to get weapons, escape its own handlers, and end up smarter once it's stolen than it was inside the lab that built it. He keeps calling all of this exciting, full of opportunity, polymaths in your pocket, but bioweapons that dodge detection, cyber attacks nobody can defend against, and proliferation to terrorists, none of that sounds like opportunity to me. It sounds like a countdown nobody agreed to start. If this worried you the way it worried me, subscribe, because every week from here is going to bring something heavier than the last.